Hi everyone, it's Susan Jones and welcome back to my Sunday Spotlight. Over the last few weeks, I've really been focusing on distance learning in the classroom. In fact, I focused on it so much and made so many videos that I went ahead and made a distance learning playlist that I will link up here as well as in the description down below. But this week I did want to take a quick little break from that and talk about 5 different ways to promote fluency in your classroom. I thought this would be an appropriate time to talk about it as we head into a new year of school. We can talk a little bit about fluency, some ways to get your students to become better readers, and most of these, if not all 5 of these tips, will definitely work whether you are teaching in person or through distance learning. So let's dive in. Now, if you've been following me for a long time, you know that I am a K through 2 teacher. That is my passion. That is what I research on a regular basis. That is where my experience lies. And fluency is such a huge part of teaching students to read that I wanted to make sure that I went ahead and made this video to kind of store on my YouTube channel to reference for later. Now, just for reference, when we are talking about reading fluency, it's the ability to read something at an appropriate rate with correct intonation, meaning you are, stopping at the punctuation marks. Your voice might go up if there's a question mark at the end of a sentence. You're reading it properly. It's kind of like reading something in a conversational voice. Now, a couple years ago, I shared this photo right here on Instagram. And it is from Phonics They Use by Patricia Cunningham. And I thought it was such an excellent kind of example of fluency because fluency is essential to reading comprehension. So in case you haven't already, go ahead and try to read this the first time through. Then I'm going to read it to you. Our brains can attend to a limited number of things at a time. If most of our attention is focused on decoding the words, there is little attention left for the comprehension part of reading. Now, that example right there kind of shows what it looks like when students are first presented with a book. Now, I'm talking about our younger students, right? When they're first presented to a bunch of text that they have to kind of decode and unscramble, they may have to read it 1, 2, 3 times through, probably like you just did with that image right there, before they can fluently read it aloud. If I just flashed that photo and said, okay, go ahead and read this, the first time you read it would probably sound pretty choppy because you're trying to figure out what it says, what it means, and things like that. So how can we go ahead and promote fluency in the classroom? Tip number 1 is to go ahead and give your students easy books. Now, I'm putting that in air quotes because I am a big lover of the reading workshop model, just like I am math workshop and writing workshop, which is why I talk a lot about it. But in reading workshop, our students have their own book bins. And we talk a lot about what a just right book is. Now, just because we talk about a just right book, I want you to think for a moment as an adult and think about the last time that you kind of looked through a book and you were like, oh, this is just right for me. It's not too hard. You haven't, picked up a book and started counting how many words you don't know in a story. You know what a just right book is and you know how to read quite a bit of stories. I do like to show my students though, especially when teaching that unit, because a lot of them are like, oh, Mrs. Jones, you can read everything though, you're a grown-up. And I'll pull out like a medical journal and try to read those words and explain that I'm gonna have to read this quite a few times if I ever even understand what it means. But anyway, backtracking. In my classroom inside their book bins, I try to have them get about 3 just right books, give or take. I'm not super strict about it. And then they also get 3 choice books, which a lot of times my students can pick either a much harder book or a much easier book. And I often find as I'm circulating the room that many of my students picked an easy book. And why do they do this? Because they can read it. They feel confident in their reading ability and they can read it over and over and over. The more your students can read something that is below their technical level, they can become more fluent in what they're reading. So make those easy books accessible to them. Don't always be, pushing them to the next level like we can sometimes do, especially in those younger grades. Tip number 2 is to go ahead and integrate poetry into your reading lessons and make it accessible to your students. So in my classroom, I think I've talked about this probably a few times in different reading videos that I've made on this channel, but we would always use phonics poems. Here's a picture of it right here. And with these phonics poems, we would do 1 or 2 a week, usually try to stick to 1, and we would read it over and over and over. We would basically, first students would listen to me read it aloud and they would echo read it after me. They would read it to a partner. We would whisper read it. We would read it like a robot. We would do all sorts of different ways in practicing reading this poem that by the end of the week, even if there were many words they couldn't decode at the beginning, they were basically fluent by the end. Poems have a natural rhythm that allows students' voices to rise and fall while they read naturally. So when students get to listen to you read the poems and then they hear themselves and their partners and the other classmates read the poems, they become more fluent as they read. These poems are something we would also keep in a poetry folder that we would always keep in our reading bins as well. So throughout the year, my students will have their own book bin where they switch out different books, and they also have this phonics poetry folder that they are allowed to read any time during that reading workshop block. They're allowed to go ahead and take it out and read through those poems if they want to. Tip number 3 is to read and reread short phonics passages. Now, I wanted to say short passages because it can be really helpful for students to practice their fluency on a much shorter piece of work. Instead of giving them, a big 10-page book, have them practice these short little passages. These are ones here, let me insert a couple pictures of some of my read and illustrate phonics passages, and I made these for students to be able to take the phonics patterns that we are learning and practice decoding them. Now, there's 2 different levels. There's a level where students can go ahead and just read a sentence and then illustrate what the sentence says. And there's also one that has an entire paragraph that students can read through, find that phonics pattern, and go ahead and illustrate. The illustration part, of course, is the part where they are really checking for their comprehension. So if students are able to read it fluently, then they can understand what the passage is saying, and they'll be able to illustrate that in the picture box. Those read and illustrate passages are something I made a few years ago. I actually have some free ones that you can try that all focus on long vowels with silent E on the end. Here's what that cover looks like, and I will link this down in the description. But I also want to share that I've come up with some shorter ones that are like beginning readers, and we are talking about beginning reading comprehension checks that are digital. So here's a little video of how that works. It's something that I just created a few weeks ago that you can use in Seesaw and or Google Classroom, and there's also a printable version as well. Just like the other one, students would go ahead and read a much shorter passage than the other version, and they would actually read it through 3 times to practice their fluency. They would answer 2 basic comprehension questions, and then there's actually a spot in the digital version for them to go ahead and drag over the illustration that matches what happened in the passage. It's just a really fun and interactive way for students to not only practice some phonics skills, but they again are practicing their fluency, and also checking for their comprehension. Tip number 4 is to model fluency. Now that might seem obvious and it might think, wait a second, I'm doing that all the time, but I want you to really try to focus on your fluency as you're reading aloud to the class. Now you'll probably have some pretty direct lessons on fluency and what that might sound like when reading aloud, but even when you're not directly teaching students what fluency is, you still want to emulate that throughout your read aloud. So when you're reading, you want to make sure that you sound like you're having fun. You want your voice to match the text. If there's characters' voices and they're being silly or they're being angry, whatever it is, you want to show your students that you're having fun reading that book and that you're also understanding what it's saying. You are not reading too fast, you're not reading too slow, you're, reading the punctuation. Every time you go ahead and model that for your students, you're showing them what proper reading and what fluency looks like. Now, usually after I go ahead and read a book aloud to the class, I will ask if there's anyone who wants to take it with them for their independent reading time and practice reading the book the way I did. Now, again, even if they can't read the words, they do like to go ahead and reread the book and they reread the pictures, so it's a great retelling thing anyway. But if your student is able to go ahead and read those words, you'll often find that they read it just like you did. They read it with their voices going up and down, and they add their own character twists. It's a lot of fun. And tip number 5 for promoting reading fluency is to use readers' theater. Partner plays and reading theater is one of my favorite things to do with the class, and the class usually finds it to be a lot of fun. Now, I usually use these partner plays a few times throughout the year, and I will do it when I am explicitly teaching about fluency. So when I'm telling them that their voice needs to, not be too fast, not be too slow, they need to reread their work many, many times before they read it aloud. This is a perfect time to kind of practice and teach what fluency looks like and sounds like in your classroom. So when I'm doing Reader's Theater in the classroom, I usually give them their poems on Monday, and I let them know that throughout the week, we're gonna carve out some time. I usually carve out about 15 minutes at the end of my reading workshop block. And every single day that week, they are going to practice reading their lines from their partner play or their Reader's Workshop script. So they will practice those lines over and over and over until they can read it fluently and they can read it with expression and things like that. I also love Reader's Theater because, of course, at the end of the week, we put on our little performances and students get to practice their speaking skills as well as their listening skills. And just one other tip about Reader's Theater is that usually after anybody kind of gives any presentation or reads something in my classroom, we will always do a compliment and or feedback that the class can give. But for this one specifically, I always make sure my students give a compliment or some feedback about the student's fluency. So they can share a specific example about they really love the way that so-and-so said that line. They thought it was really funny or something like that. So that is just another fun thing for Reader's Theater. In terms of where I find my reading theater scripts, there are quite a few if you just go ahead on Google and search, but for K through 2 specifically, I love the ones on Reading A to Z, and there's a couple Scholastic books that I also love that I think are really appropriate for your students to go ahead, read, reread, and get their fluency down. I will link those in the description down below as well. So there you have 5 fun ways to promote reading fluency in your classroom this year. I hope you've enjoyed these tips. If you have, please go ahead and give me a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new week's video. I'll see you next Sunday. Bye.